She thought her Tinder date was just another harmless night out. But when she realized the truth, it was already too late. What happens next will leave you speechless. Keep watching to find out how a simple date turns into a deadly game of survival. The evening air was chilly. A breeze rustled through the trees, whispering secrets. She pulled her coat tighter around her. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from him. His name was James. They had matched a few days ago on Tinder. His profile was simple, but his smile was warm. A few texts and they agreed to meet at the new cafe downtown. Her heart fluttered with excitement. It had been a while since she'd felt this way. The cafe was quiet, cozy. Warm lights bathed the small wooden tables. She arrived early, wanting to settle in. The air smelled like fresh coffee and baked goods. She chose a table by the window. Time passed slowly. She glanced at her phone again. A new message on my way. Her stomach did a little flip. Soon she saw him. James. Tall, dark hair, and a confident smile. He waved as he walked toward her. Her nerves seemed to calm. He was even more handsome in person. Hi, he said softly, his voice smooth. Hi, she replied, her voice a little shaky. He sat down. They exchanged small talk at first. But the more they spoke, the more she noticed something strange. His eyes lingered too long. A little too intense. His smile didn't reach his eyes. She told herself it was nothing. It had been a long day. Her thoughts drifted to the sound of clinking cups and low conversations around her. The room felt too warm now. Her fingers tapped nervously on the table. Would you like to get out of here? He asked, his voice suddenly low. She hesitated. The question felt off. But he looked so inviting, so polite. Sure, she said finally, smiling weakly. They left the cafe. The cold air hit her face. She shivered, but tried to hide it. He led her down the street. It was getting darker. The city streets were quieter now. The hum of distant traffic barely reached her ears. She felt a pang of unease. Something about the silence felt heavy. It wasn't just the hour. It was something in the air. Something in him. She couldn't put her finger on it. But she felt it. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. She turned to say something to him, but he was already looking at her. His expression had changed. Gone was the warmth. Now his eyes were cold. Sharp. She took a step back, but he moved closer. Too close. She could feel his breath on her skin. His hand brushed against hers, sending a chill down her spine. Let's go to my car, he said, his voice almost a whisper. Her instincts screamed at her to run. But she didn't. Not yet. She nodded. He grinned. Too wide. And for the first time she saw it. Something dark. Something dangerous. The smile didn't feel warm anymore. It was almost predatory. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. She followed him, her feet heavy with hesitation. The car was parked a few blocks away. A black sedan, sleek and quiet in the dim light. He opened the door for her. She hesitated, just for a moment. But then, she slid into the passenger seat. The door clicked shut with a cold finality. She felt trapped. The car smelled faintly of leather and something else metallic. She tried to shake the feeling. He started the engine, the low rumble vibrating through her. She stared out the window, her hands clenched in her lap. The streetlights flickered as they drove through empty roads. The city felt distant now, quiet and lifeless. Her stomach churned, a knot of dread tightening with every passing second. The silence between them was suffocating. She couldn't stand it anymore. Where are we going? Her voice sounded small, distant even to herself. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached over and turned the music on. A haunting melody filled the space, soft and eerie. Her breath caught. She looked over at him, but his eyes were fixed on the road ahead. His grip on the wheel was firm, almost rigid. And then, without warning, the car slowed. He turned off the main road and drove into a dark, wooded area. The trees loomed like silent watchers, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up again. She felt the weight of his gaze on her, even though he hadn't looked at her. A deep sense of wrongness settled in her bones. "Why here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Still no answer. Her heart was racing now, the beat loud in her ears. She looked out the window, desperately searching for a sign of civilization. But all she saw were trees and shadows. A sharp turn. The car jolted. She glanced over, catching a glimpse of something in his expression. It was fleeting, but it was there. A coldness. An emptiness. Her pulse hammered in her chest. Before she could say anything else, he slammed on the brakes. The car came to a stop. Suddenly, everything was still. Too still. Her mind screamed at her to run. But she couldn't move. She was frozen. He turned off the engine. The music died. And there, in the thick silence, she finally understood. They walked in silence, her heart pounding louder with each step. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows. His footsteps echoed behind her. She could hear his breathing now, steady and calm. But hers was quick, erratic. Her mind raced, but her body couldn't move fast enough. They reached his car, parked on a quiet side street. It was a black sedan, sleek but unremarkable. He opened the door for her. "After you," he said, a little too smoothly. She hesitated, eyes scanning the darkness. The air felt thick now, almost suffocating. Her fingers grazed the cool metal of the car door. Then, without thinking, she stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind her. It was too quiet inside. The car smelled like leather and something else, faintly metallic. Her skin prickled with discomfort. He slid into the driver's seat, locking the door with a soft click. His hand gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white. He didn't start the car immediately. For a moment, they just sat there. The tension was palpable. She wanted to ask him where they were going, but her throat felt tight. She could feel his gaze on her, the heat of it, even though she refused to look at him. The engine rumbled to life. The car moved slowly, taking a turn down a street she didn't recognize. Her mind screamed for her to stop this, to get out now. But she was paralyzed. What was it about him? What was wrong? She glanced out the window, trying to calm herself, but everything felt wrong now. The streetlights grew fewer. The buildings taller, more foreboding. A sharp turn. Then another. The car seemed to be heading further from the city. Her stomach twisted. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. He didn't answer at first. Then, in a low, calm voice, he said, "Somewhere quiet." The hairs on her neck stood straight. Her hands clenched in her lap. Something wasn't right. The world outside the window grew darker, more desolate. She tried to open the door, but it was locked. Her pulse raced. The silence between them was suffocating. Then, a soft laugh escaped his lips. "I like you," he said suddenly. She turned to look at him, the words hanging in the air. His smile was twisted now. "I think we're going to get along just fine." Her blood ran cold. The smile on his face didn't reach his eyes. They were flat, empty. A chill crawled up her spine, her fingers trembling. She glanced at the door again, wishing it would unlock. But it didn't. She felt trapped. The car moved through the darkness, the headlights casting eerie shadows on the trees that lined the road. Her breath came in shallow gasps. The silence between them was suffocating. His eyes were still on her, but now it felt like he was studying her. She couldn't understand why she hadn't run yet. Why was she still here? He turned his head to the side, glancing at her with a strange intensity. Her stomach twisted in knots. The air in the car felt thicker now, heavy with something she couldn't place. Suddenly, he slowed the car. The road ahead was empty, leading into an even darker stretch of forest. She looked around frantically. Her mind raced, but there was no plan. No escape. He reached for the glove compartment. Her eyes widened. Was he reaching for a weapon? Her heart pounded in her chest, a drumbeat of panic. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a small, sharp knife. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat. He held it up in his hand, examining it with a strange sense of calm. "I was wondering how long it would take you to realize," he said, his voice still soft. She couldn't speak. Her mouth went dry. Was this it? He chuckled darkly, noticing her fear. "I'm not going to hurt you yet," he said. Her stomach twisted violently. The car slowed to a stop in the middle of nowhere. Tall trees surrounded them, their limbs like twisted fingers in the night. There was nothing but silence now. Nothing but the sound of her heart racing in her chest. She wanted to scream, to claw at the door, to run. But she couldn't. The knife was still in his hand. It gleamed in the dim light. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw it. The insanity behind them. She was trapped. And now she knew for sure. She was in the car with a killer. Her breath caught in her throat, heart hammering in her chest. He didn't move at first. Just sat there, holding the knife loosely in his hand, staring at her. For a moment, everything was still. Too still. Her mind raced, desperately searching for a way out. She couldn't stay here. But she couldn't move either. He broke the silence. His voice low, almost tender. "I've been planning this for weeks." Her stomach churned. Her body was frozen, trapped in place, but her mind screamed to get out. She glanced around. The car was surrounded by darkness. Nothing but towering trees. The faint sound of the wind through the branches sent shivers down her spine. She swallowed hard, trying to push the panic down. "I didn't think you'd be so beautiful," he continued, his words almost soothing. "But now I realize it's perfect. You were perfect." His words felt like a twisted lullaby. She was paralyzed by fear, her pulse deafening in her ears. It was too late. Her throat burned as she fought to swallow, to speak. But nothing came out. "I've been watching you," he said, his eyes gleaming. "I knew we'd meet eventually." A flicker of confusion crossed her mind. He had been watching her? Her phone buzzed in her pocket. The sound made her jump, her nerves raw. She pulled it out instinctively, praying it wasn't too late. The screen lit up, no signal. Nothing. She was alone. Completely alone. His eyes never left her, as if he could read her every thought. "You're wondering why I chose you," he said, his lips curling into a grin. "Why you, out of all the others?" She wanted to scream, but her voice wouldn't come. Her hand reached for the door again, her fingers slipping against the handle, frantic. But it was still locked. Her body trembled, fear gripping her like ice. He smiled wider, noticing her panic. "I've had my eye on you for some time," he whispered. "You are perfect for what I need." "What do you need?" She finally managed to croak, her voice barely audible. His grin faltered, then returned darker. "Just a little company," he said, as if it was the simplest thing in the world. Her blood ran cold again. The realization hit her like a slap. She wasn't just a date. She was a victim. And he wasn't planning to let her go. The knife gleamed in the dim light of the car. His grip on it tightened. Her heart raced. Her mind screamed for her to do something, anything. But her limbs felt like lead. He leaned closer, his breath cold against her skin. His eyes never left hers. "You think you can get away?" he whispered, his voice low and thick. She recoiled, instinctively trying to press herself against the seat. The car felt smaller, suffocating. Every breath she took was shallow, her chest tight with fear. She had to do something. Her fingers were trembling as she reached toward the glove compartment, hoping against hope that it might be unlocked. Her hand brushed the latch. It clicked open. Her pulse quickened. Inside, there were just a few papers, a bottle of water, and something small. A pen. She grabbed it, her hand closing tightly around it. It wasn't much, but it was something. His eyes flickered to the compartment. He laughed softly. "Think that'll save you?" His voice was mocking now, but there was an edge to it. She didn't wait. Her hand shot out, the pen aimed at his face. A flash of desperation filled her, a desperate need to fight back. He jerked his head away, startled by the sudden movement, but his hand remained steady on the wheel. She swung again, harder this time, her body moving toward him, her fear turning into raw survival instinct. The pen grazed his cheek, drawing a small line of blood. He snarled, fury flashing across his face. "Bad choice," he spat. She didn't hesitate. With all the force she could muster, she twisted the door handle again. This time, it clicked. The door swung open. The cold air rushed in. Her eyes locked on the dark woods outside. She didn't think. She bolted. Her feet hit the ground hard as she stumbled out of the car, heart racing, legs unsteady. Behind her, she heard him curse, but she didn't dare look back. Branches scraped against her skin as she pushed through the underbrush, branches tearing at her clothes. The night was alive with the sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, and her ragged breathing. She ran as fast as her legs could carry her. Every step was a fight against her own fear, her own exhaustion. The darkness around her felt suffocating, as if the trees themselves were closing in. But she couldn't stop. Not yet. Then, ahead, she saw a flicker of light. A cabin. A small, run-down cabin at the edge of the woods. Her heart skipped a beat. She had to reach it. She pushed harder, ignoring the sharp pain in her side, the stitch that burned in her chest. The cabin was closer now. She could see the faint glow of a light from inside. She was almost there. Almost safe. Then suddenly a sharp tug on her arm. She screamed, her body jerking backward. Before she could react, he yanked her toward him, his grip strong and unyielding. She kicked, struggled, but his hand was like iron. "Going somewhere," he hissed in her ear, his breath hot against her skin. Her body went cold with terror. There was no escape. Not anymore. Her pulse hammered in her ears as he dragged her back toward the car. She kicked and screamed, but it was useless. His grip was relentless, his hands like steel around her wrist. The cabin, her only hope, disappeared into the shadows behind her. She felt the cold air on her skin, her legs barely keeping up with his swift steps. "You're not running anywhere," he muttered, his voice dark, almost soothing. His breath was shallow, as if the chase had excited him, fed something dark inside. She felt the sharp sting of his fingers as they tightened around her arm. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Her mind was a frantic blur of survival, but her body felt slow, heavy. With a sudden movement, he pushed her toward the car. She stumbled, tripping over her own feet. But he was there, always there, never giving her a chance to regain control. Her heart sank as he opened the door to the passenger seat again, shoving her inside roughly. The cold metal of the car door slammed shut with a finality that echoed in her chest. He climbed into the driver's seat, locking the door behind him, his movements calm, controlled. The engine roared to life once more, but this time, she didn't even try to fight it. The exhaustion was overwhelming. Her arms ached, her legs felt like they were made of stone. And the terror gnawed at her insides, a constant, gnawing presence. She had failed. She had let herself believe there was still a chance. But now, she was back in the car, and he was driving her deeper into the unknown. Her thoughts were a tangle of fear and panic. She could hear his breathing again, steady, almost calm. But there was nothing calm about the situation. His eyes never left the road, but he spoke softly, as if to himself. "You're mine now," he said, his voice a cold whisper. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. She shivered, the reality of it settling over her like a blanket of ice. Where was he taking her? Was there any hope left? The forest outside the car window was pitch black, and the road stretched on endlessly ahead. She felt the weight of her body against the seat, every inch of her tense with fear, with the sickening feeling that escape was impossible now. There was only him, only the cold, empty road stretching forward. And the knife. The small, sharp knife resting on the seat between them. Her hands clenched, but she didn't know what to do. She couldn't run, couldn't fight him. Not anymore. His voice broke through her thoughts again, low and cruel. You'll see soon enough. It's just you and me now. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Her breath faltered. Where was he taking her? Would she ever see the light again? He didn't answer. The car continued to glide through the darkness. And in that moment, she knew she was utterly alone. The world outside the car had become a blur, a black void swallowing everything in its path. Her fingers were numb as they gripped the edge of the seat, the metal of the seatbelt digging into her chest. Every breath she took felt like it might be her last. Her mind raced. She had to find a way out. But how? Her eyes darted around the car, searching for something, anything, that could help her. There was nothing, just the empty space between them, the darkness pressing in. She dared not look at him, but she could feel his presence beside her, cold and suffocating. His eyes never strayed from the road, his face an unreadable mask. She glanced down at her hands, trembling uncontrollably. The knife was still there. She couldn't take her eyes off it. Every time the car hit a bump in the road, her body jerked slightly, her gaze flitting to the gleaming blade. Could she somehow get to it? Her pulse spiked at the thought. Her fingers curled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a flicker of hope. It was a small, fragile hope, but it was there. The knife. It was her only chance. His voice cut through the silence, startling her. "You're thinking too much," he said, a smirk in his voice. Her heart skipped a beat. Did he know what she was planning? Was he reading her mind? "I know what you're thinking," he continued, his eyes never leaving the road. "You're thinking about the knife. You think it'll help you, don't you?" Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't said a word. "I'm not an idiot," he added with a chuckle. "You'll never get to it in time." Her blood ran cold. He knew. He knew everything. She wanted to scream, wanted to claw her way out of the car, out of this nightmare. But her body felt like it was made of stone, unable to move, unable to act. And then, the car slowed, creeping down an even darker stretch of road. Her heart began to pound faster, a primal fear taking over. She could feel the moment approaching. The moment when everything would change. When there would be no turning back. He turned to her then, his eyes cold, his smile thin and predatory. "I told you," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You're mine now." The words hung in the air between them, a twisted promise. Her eyes darted to the door, to the window. But there was nowhere to go. No escape. The road ahead stretched endlessly, as if leading her towards some final, inescapable fate. And in that moment, she understood. No matter how hard she fought, she was not getting out of this alive. Not unless something drastic happened. Her mind raced, her fingers twitching with an urge to act, to do something, anything. But the knife, it was still just out of reach. The car rolled to a stop, the engine rumbling softly in the stillness of the night. For a moment, it felt as if time had frozen. Her heart thudded in her chest, painfully loud. The darkness outside was absolute, suffocating. She didn't dare move. His eyes were on her now, and the cold, calculating look in them made her stomach churn. "Get out," he commanded, his voice flat, emotionless. Her breath hitched in her throat. She looked at the door, her fingers trembling against the seatbelt. Her mind screamed at her to run, to jump out of the car, to do anything to escape. but her body was paralyzed with fear, every muscle locked in place. The door seemed so far away, a world of distance between her and freedom. "Now," he said again, his voice lower, sharper. She hesitated. She couldn't think. What would happen if she didn't move? What would he do? A sickening thought flashed through her mind. What if this was it? What if he just wanted to finish it? Her breath quickened. Her chest ached with each shallow inhale. She had no choice. Slowly, cautiously, she unbuckled her seatbelt. His eyes never left her. She pushed the door open, the sound of it creaking in the stillness. The cold air hit her face like a slap. The ground beneath her was uneven, gravel crunching under her shoes as she stepped out of the car. The wind howled through the trees, a distant, mournful sound. The headlights of the car illuminated the dark landscape around her, trees that loomed like dark sentinels, a field stretching out into the abyss. She took a step forward, her legs shaky, but she knew better than to look back. Every instinct in her screamed at her to run, to put as much distance between herself and him as possible. But where? Where would she go? The forest was thick, impenetrable. The road, if it could even be called that, led nowhere but further into isolation. She couldn't outrun him. Not on foot. Her eyes flicked to the car, then to him. He was watching her carefully, his expression unreadable. "I don't know why you're trying," he said quietly, as if speaking to himself. "I've already won." She forced herself to stay calm. Focus. She glanced around, searching for something, anything, to help her. And then, just as her mind began to dull with despair, she saw it. A small, jagged rock. It wasn't much, but it was something. Her fingers curled around it, her knuckles white with the effort. The weight of the stone felt solid in her hand, comforting in its sharpness. For the first time in what felt like hours, she felt a flicker of defiance. He wasn't going to take her without a fight. Her fingers tightened around the rock, her pulse quickening. But before she could make her move, he spoke again. "Don't even think about it," he said, his voice cold and sharp, almost amused. Her heart stopped. He had known what she was planning. But she didn't let go of the rock. If she had one chance, just one. He laughed softly, darkly, as if reading her thoughts. "I told you," he said, his smile spreading across his face. "You're mine." She tightened her grip on the rock, her chest tightening with a surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was her moment. She wasn't going to go down without a fight. Her fingers clenched tighter around the rock, the rough edges biting into her skin. She didn't know if she had the strength, the courage. But there was no turning back now. The air between them crackled, charged with the tension of the moment. His eyes narrowed, his body tense, as if he could sense her thoughts. For the first time since she'd met him, she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. He was watching her too closely. She could feel the weight of his eyes, and it made her even more determined. She didn't wait any longer. With all the strength she could muster, she hurled the rock at his head. It flew through the air, and for a heartbeat, everything felt suspended in time. Then, the sharp crack of the rock connecting with his temple rang out in the silence. His head snapped to the side, and he staggered back, momentarily stunned. Her heart leapt in her chest. She had to move. She turned and bolted, her legs pumping furiously as she ran toward the woods. The trees blurred past her, their branches scraping against her skin. She didn't dare look back. Her breath was ragged, but she didn't stop. She ran harder, faster, the adrenaline pushing her beyond her limits. She could hear his footsteps now, pounding behind her, but she didn't slow down. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks threatening to trip her up, but she kept going. The forest seemed endless, but there, just ahead, was a break in the trees. A clearing. Her heart skipped a beat. She was so close. The moonlight filtered through the canopy, illuminating the small patch of grass. She reached the edge of the clearing, her legs burning with exhaustion, but she didn't dare stop. She could hear him now, gaining on her, his breathing ragged. But then, something else caught her ear, a different sound. The distant hum of a car engine. Was it another car? Her mind raced, but her legs didn't falter. She could reach the road. She could get help. But just as the hope began to bloom, something caught her ankle. She cried out as she fell forward, the ground rushing up to meet her. Her palms scraped against the dirt, but she didn't care. She scrambled to her feet, but it was too late. A hand gripped her arm, pulling her back. "Where do you think you're going?" His voice whispered in her ear, the sound cold and full of finality. Her heart sank. Her body was on fire, every muscle screaming, but he was too strong. Her fingers reached out, desperate for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing. She was back in his grasp, the cold steel of his hand locking around her wrist. The clearing, the road, the hope, they were all slipping away. The dark forest surrounded them once more. She could feel him smiling behind her, that sickening smile that made her skin crawl. "You never really had a chance," he murmured. And in that moment, she realized the truth. She was never meant to escape. Not from him. Not from this nightmare. Her breath was ragged, shallow, as she felt the grip on her wrist tighten even further. She was too exhausted to fight back, her body too drained from the panic, the sprint, the endless running. The hope that had flickered inside her, just a moment ago, was fading fast. Her knees buckled as he yanked her to her feet, dragging her toward the trees, deeper into the darkness. She couldn't see anything but shadows now, the world reduced to the sound of his footsteps and her own panicked breathing. The clearing was gone, the road, the distant hum of a car, vanished into the vast expanse of night. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat a thundering reminder of the helplessness that was creeping in, settling over her like a suffocating blanket. There was nowhere left to run. No one could save her. His voice, low and menacing, floated to her ears. "You thought you could escape," he murmured, almost lovingly. "But you're mine. You always were." She shuddered, her entire body trembling with the weight of his words. He was right. From the moment she stepped into the car, from the moment their eyes locked, she had been trapped. Her stomach twisted painfully. She couldn't accept it, couldn't let it be true. But it was. She was lost. Her mind screamed for a way out, but her body refused to respond. Every muscle felt weak, every thought muddled with the overwhelming sense of dread. He dragged her farther into the forest, the moonlight barely piercing through the thick canopy above. The air grew colder as they moved, the sharp scent of pine filling her nostrils, mixing with the earthy smell of the underbrush. Her feet scraped against the rough ground, but she couldn't find the strength to fight. Every step he took was deliberate, each one taking her further from the world she knew, from the light. Her thoughts blurred, spinning in chaotic circles. What did he want from her? Why had he chosen her? Her throat tightened, but no words came. He pulled her to a stop, and she was forced to face him. For the first time, his grip loosened just enough for her to breathe. Her eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but all she saw were the dense trees, the darkness. He laughed softly, that cold, empty laugh that sent a chill down her spine. "You still think you can run?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost amused. She didn't answer, couldn't answer. The truth was too much to bear. "I told you," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. "You belong to me." The weight of his words settled on her chest, crushing her spirit, suffocating her hope. She was nothing more than prey, a victim in his twisted game. And there was no one coming to save her. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the forest floor, the cold earth pressing against her skin. Her body refused to move, her mind numb, paralyzed by the terror, the overwhelming sense of defeat. And in that moment, she understood. This was it. This was the end. Her body trembled against the cold, the ground beneath her unforgiving, rough, and unyielding. She could feel the weight of the earth pressing down on her, as if it were trying to swallow her whole. Her heart still raced, but the fire of defiance she had once felt was nearly gone, replaced by a paralyzing numbness. He stood over her, looming like a shadow, his breath steady and calm, as though he had all the time in the world. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. "You look so helpless," he said, the words almost tender, as if he were savoring her weakness. Her mind screamed at her to do something, anything, but her body refused to cooperate. She felt like a puppet, dangling on invisible strings, powerless in his hands. He crouched down in front of her, and for the first time, she had no choice but to look into his eyes. Cold, calculating, devoid of any emotion beyond control. "You should have known better," he whispered, his voice just a breath away from her ear. "You never had a chance." The tears threatened to spill, but she bit her lip to keep them in check. Her body was betraying her, but her mind was still sharp, still searching for a way to fight, to survive. It was then that she heard it, the faint sound of movement from behind. Her heart leapt into her throat, and for the briefest moment, she thought she had imagined it. But it came again, louder this time. A twig snapping underfoot. His head snapped to the side, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the forest around them. She seized the moment of distraction, pushing herself up, her hands scraping against the rough ground, her legs shaky but moving on pure instinct. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Her breath was ragged as she stumbled forward, her vision blurring with tears, her heart pounding so loudly she feared he could hear it. The forest had become an obstacle course. Every step she took felt like an eternity, the darkness closing in around her like a suffocating blanket. But there was a light ahead. A distant, flickering light. It was small but real. She focused all her energy on it, her mind fixated on the hope it represented. Her body screamed in protest, but she forced herself to push forward, ignoring the burning in her legs, the throbbing in her chest. She was so close to freedom. But then, she felt it again, a hand on her shoulder, gripping her tightly. She screamed, her body jerking away from him, but it was no use. He was too strong. With a swift movement, he spun her around to face him, his eyes dark with rage. "You really thought you could escape?" he spat, his grip tightening painfully around her arm. Her mind raced, but her body felt like it was made of lead. No matter how hard she fought, she was trapped again. Her gaze flickered to the light once more. It was still there, faint but steady. She was so close. Her heart pounded in her ears as the last bit of hope flickered in her chest. She had to reach it. There had to be something, someone. She couldn't give up now. The grip on her arm was unrelenting, cold fingers digging into her skin. Her entire body screamed in protest, but she could barely move. She had no more strength to fight, no more energy to resist. Her chest heaved with ragged breaths as she struggled to keep herself upright. His eyes burned with a cold intensity, but something was different now. He wasn't smiling, not with that same twisted amusement. He was angry, furious. "You never learn," he muttered under his breath, pulling her closer, his breath hot on her ear. "You think you can escape me, but you'll never escape, do you understand? This is your reality now." Her heart hammered in her chest, but there was a flicker of something inside her. It wasn't hope. It wasn't fear. It was defiance. Her hands trembled, but she managed to break free of his grasp, her fingertips grazing the rough bark of the trees around them. She didn't know how she found the strength, but she pushed herself forward, a sudden rush of adrenaline flooding her veins. She wasn't done yet. Not now. Not when the light was so close. She could see it now, real and solid. The flickering light was coming from a small cabin ahead, just beyond the clearing. The light of a lantern. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized that there was someone there, someone who might help her. She had no choice. She sprinted, her legs burning with every step, her heart pounding in her chest. The trees blurred past her, but the cabin was getting closer. Closer. And then, just as her feet hit the edge of the clearing, she heard him. His voice, low and cold, echoing through the still night. "I told you," he said, his voice cutting through the darkness. "You're mine." But she didn't look back. She couldn't. She ran faster, her eyes fixed on the lantern, the hope that burned brighter than anything else in the world. And just as she reached the cabin, the door swung open. A figure stepped out into the light. A woman. "Help me," she screamed, her voice desperate, raw. But the woman didn't move. She only stared at her, her expression unreadable. Her heart stopped. It was him. He was there, behind her in the shadows. She turned to flee, but it was too late. Everything went black. The world around her spun as the darkness closed in, and for a moment, she couldn't tell where the light ended and the shadows began. The cold night air, heavy with tension, felt thick in her lungs. Her feet couldn't move fast enough as the realization hit her like a wave. She had been too late. The woman in the doorway, her face unreadable, her eyes cold, wasn't a stranger after all. It was him. He had orchestrated it all. The game. The chase. And now it was over. She turned to run, her body trembling, but the world seemed to shift. The force of his grip on her arm yanked her backward, pulling her away from the door, from the hope she had thought she could reach. Her body collapsed against the rough trunk of a nearby tree. The pain in her side was sharp, but she couldn't focus on it. She couldn't focus on anything but the way his hands encircled her throat, tightening, squeezing, cutting off her breath. Her vision blurred, the edges of reality twisting and stretching until she couldn't see straight anymore. "Don't make it harder," he murmured, his voice soft, almost affectionate. The cruel irony of it made her stomach churn. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she gasped for air, her fingers clawing at his hands, but it was useless. Her world grew darker with each passing second, the last flicker of light fading from her sight. She heard him speaking again, his words distant now, as if they were coming from underwater. "You thought you could escape. You thought I didn't know. But I always know." Always? Her fingers faltered, her body going limp as the pressure continued to tighten. And then it stopped. The world went silent. There was no light, no sound, only the feeling of being swallowed whole by the abyss. For a moment, everything was still. The weight of it all settled over her like a heavy, suffocating blanket. And in that moment she understood. There was no escape. Not from him. Not from this. The nightmare had claimed her completely. And the story, at long last, was over.